Hi everyone, it's David Thompson again with Behind the Lines, the Civil War Monitors online interview series with members of the Civil War community. Today I'm joined by Dr. Elizabeth Leonard, the John J. and Cornelia V. Gibson Professor of History at Colby College and author of Lincoln's Forgotten Ally, Judge Advocate General Joseph Holt of Kentucky, which is put out by the University of North Carolina Press. So Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure.
It's very interesting because when people tend to think about Lincoln, many people may say, oh, Lincoln, he's been done before. But you have seemed to have found someone who, I believe it was James McPherson on the back of the book, who said, you rescued from historical obscurity. So why don't you tell us a little bit about this fascinating character, Joseph Holt?
Okay. Well, he is a very much forgotten member of our historical past, personage from our historical past, and he's someone who I think is probably the most important person in Lincoln's administration to have been forgotten in this way. He grew up in a little tiny town in Kentucky on the Ohio River, Stephensport, Kentucky, and his family mansion is actually still there if you want to go tooling around outside of Louisville. It's only about 90 minutes away. So he was just a regular child of a rather privileged farming/professional family. His father was a lawyer. He grew up with slavery as an important feature of his family life. But he was, of his 6 siblings, the member of his family selected by various older family members to carry the family's name forward into glory. So he was sent to good schools, he was sent to study law, and he gradually made his way up through the law profession and also became very well known in the first half of his life as an orator and as a staunch supporter of the Democratic Party, the Jacksonian Democratic Party and its descendants. But he ultimately became someone who had to leave that past behind. Although he never left his party, he did move to Washington, served in Buchanan's administration, and then when the nation fell apart, he had to make a choice, as so many people did, and he chose to go with the Union, and the rest of his life really is a reflection of that choice that he made, to stand by the Union, stand by Lincoln, stand by Lincoln's policies, both during the war and afterwards when many people were sort of forgetting what the war had been about.
And that element, the fact that he stayed with the Union when really the rest of his family did not, is real, especially probably one of the most striking examples in the book is that of his brother and the relationship that he had with his brother. I wonder, during the course of your research, did you come across some sort of idea as to why you thought he really stayed with the Union? Because, as I said, everybody else in his family went the other way. You mentioned he was very active in Democratic politics during the antebellum period. So was there one kind of factor you think that really set him apart from the rest of his family?
Well, I guess I would have to answer that by saying that we should remember he was a Jacksonian Democrat, and Jackson himself was a very strong Unionist, right? Mm-hmm. And when the nullification crisis erupted, Jackson chose the Union and stood for the Union too, and I think that Holt saw the Union in the same light. And other members of his family probably were more committed to slavery than he was. He had always shown some ambivalence about slavery, although he had lived within that system and, as I said, owned slaves himself. But when that moment came, I think he felt that slavery was not more valuable than the Union. But for many people, the decision went the other way, right? But I think for Holt, all of his life, there was already that ambivalence, and he was not willing to choose slavery over Union. Other members of his family, slavery was more important. But I see the moment when he makes that choice as being the moment when he decides to accept Buchanan's desperate plea that he serve as Secretary of War in those final months of Buchanan's administration.
And obviously, this is not somebody you are going to find during your run-of-the-mill investigations.
Not this part of his life.
No,
if
certainly.
you're interested in the assassination, you have to know who he is.
Right.
But you only know, typically, this tiny slice of his life. I can't tell you how many people I've met who've never even heard of him. I've just been reading, I read Civil War books all the time, and he's never mentioned, even in the most highly revered Civil War texts. And yet, to me, he's clearly such an important figure, but you just don't find him.
And I was wondering, maybe, you mentioned in your preface quite a remarkable story as to how you really came across Holt initially. Right. I was wondering if you might be able to share that with our readers a little bit, or our viewers, I should say.
I initially encountered Joseph Holt in connection with Dr. Mary Walker, if that's what you're referring to. In my very first book, I looked at women's involvement in the Civil War on the Union side, and I was studying Mary Walker as an example of one woman's extreme and unique contribution to the war effort. She served as a doctor during the war, first for a long time as a volunteer, very much wanted a commission as a surgeon, and ultimately got a contract as a contract surgeon, a civilian surgeon for the Union Army. And then when the war was over, she wanted to continue in the medical establishment of the federal government, but it was Joseph Holt who was the chief legal mind within the administration, apart from the Attorney General, but the chief legal mind relative to military affairs, who said, there is no precedent for this, we'll give her the Medal of Honor and send her on her way, which is what they did. So that was my first encounter with him, which was actually quite negative, and my negative feelings lasted for quite a long time. But then I encountered him again when I started researching the Lincoln assassination, and slowly he began to seem like a much fuller and richer character than I had imagined him to be, and then that many people imagined him to be.
And, I mean, why has it taken this long for someone to really set the record straight about Holt? As you said, if you're knowledgeable about the assassination, you've come across the name before.
Right.
But to really give the full context of his life, it's a wonderful book, but I wonder, why has it taken this long for his story really to come out for everyone to see?
I think there are probably a number of factors in that. One is that I think there is a great deal of satisfaction that people have with just assuming he was, this vengeful prosecutor of the poor, benighted conspirators, particularly Mary Surratt. That fits into a kind of way we have understood the Civil War, thanks to a lot of, what do we call it? Now I'm blanking on it. When we just say, oh, the poor, Robert E. Lee couldn't possibly have won against Grant.
The Lost Cause.
The Lost Cause, thank you very much. So thanks to a lot of Lost Cause ideology, I think he fits a kind of mold that we have about the vengeful North, Stanton and Holt. Robert Redford's film also contributes to this, the vengeful Stanton and Holt that appear in The Conspirator and so on. So I think there's that. I think there's the fact that Holt really was a very complicated and difficult character, and you have to have a lot of patience with him to stick with him and study him. And frankly, I'm sure that I could not have lived with him either, personally. He's very difficult, but so you have to kind of stick with him and be willing to deal with a very complicated character. He also, at the end of his life, made no effort to preserve his own memory. So many Civil War figures really tried to keep their memory out there, keep their name out there, and he was very reserved and angry, actually, at the way the post-war period went, I think, and so he withdrew into himself and preserved his own memory. And I think Kentucky, his home state, hasn't really done much to preserve his memory either. I love Kentucky. I've thoroughly enjoyed visiting there and doing scholarship there, and the people have been wonderful, and they're all very interested now, thank goodness. But I think Kentucky, after the war, really struggled with its role in the war and a kind of frustration that emancipation ended up, being part of the Union's war efforts. And it was hard to celebrate Holt if you were going to then kind of be a post-war Confederate state. Holt didn't really have a role to play there. So I think there's a lot of reasons. But I think if you read this book, most people who have spoken to me have said, I just can't understand why I haven't heard of him before. Why don't we know him? Because you say he did this and he did this and he did this, and interestingly enough, the materials are there to research too. It's not that there aren't any materials.
Yeah, he certainly was a man who wore many hats, I guess you could say.
Left a huge paper trail for us to follow. I mean, it's immense.
Which, as historians, is always wonderful.
Wonderful. No, I'm not researching email. I'm researching letters.
Do you wonder, in this, I guess we could call it maybe this post-Blight era, where memory has started to really become, obviously, a major field within the profession for study, do you see your work as part of a larger trend for other historians to try and, so to speak, rescue some of these individuals, or at least clarify stories of individuals who have kind of wandered off into obscurity over the past decades?
Yeah. I think that historians have always been, in many ways, trying to, that's what revisionist history is anyway, although we tend to use that term very pejoratively. Of course, history by its nature is a revisionist discipline. We have to keep going back and trying to understand things in new ways as new materials come to light, as new perspectives are developed, and so on. So I don't know if I would tie it to the memory studies as much as our persistent desire as historians to keep going back and learning more about the past. I will say, however, that I think that there are perhaps, we know that we have gone over and over and over this ground of the Civil War, over and over, and some people want to keep going over that same ground, but what I see my work as being part of here is the effort to find that new ground, because we know there's a lot about the Civil War that we haven't studied. I think through Gilpin Faust's book on the Republic of Suffering and death in the Civil War. How is it we didn't have a book about death in the Civil War yet? James Martin's books about children in the Civil War. How did we not think about children in the Civil War? Or Margaret Creighton's book, Colors of Courage. How did we not think about the Battle of Gettysburg or other battles in terms of what they did to the towns where they happened, right? So there are a number of people who are trying to come at the war from new perspectives, and I see my work as part of that.
I wonder if you could perhaps speak a little bit to maybe a piece of advice or a struggle that you had researching this project as a biography, because we do have a lot of viewers who are doing research, certainly, that deal with biographies, and they come with potentially a whole host of problems. But I was wondering if you had a piece of advice or just something to avoid or something you wish you had known when you had started kind of this endeavor.
Well, biography is very tough. For one thing, you really become very invested in whoever the person is, your biographical subject. And it is hard to try to maintain any kind of neutrality. And I recognize that I can't about Holt. But in that sense, I think, the first thing you need to remember always to do is confess your bias, right? I think a great deal of Joseph Holt. I think he's gotten a raw deal. That's my bias. I'm trying to uncover other things. But it is hard to stay neutral, and you just simply have to try your best to do so and confess when you can't. I think it's also very difficult, particularly in the case of someone like Holt, who was so private. He left us a lot of stuff to look at. But I think some stuff is in his papers that he would not have wanted people to look at. And I actually know that for sure because I was looking at some letters that were between him and his first wife. And after I'd read several of them, I found a note that had been originally wrapped around those letters that said, should these letters survive my death, they should be burned. And he didn't really want people to read them. And that was a very difficult struggle for me to decide what then, with this very private man, do I feel comfortable including or excluding? I want to tell the story of his life. The papers are there. How do I respect him and who he was and so on? And that's a judgment call. In my case, I was very fortunate. I had various scholars I could talk to, but I also had descendants of his brother's family who seemed to me the ones who would be most hurt by, some sort of exposure. It's not that there was anything terrible in there, it's just private stuff. And so I was able to talk to them about it, how to handle that kind of issue. That's tough. I would say get a lot of advice, talk to a lot of people and read other good biographies, And I actually, and I will say one more thing, I was strongly advised by a couple people to cut out a lot of the personal life of Holt in this manuscript. I think that's partly because the manuscript was huge. He lived for 87 years. He did a lot of things. Originally the manuscript was at least 100 pages longer than the book ended up. And I resisted that advice because to me, what was gripping to me in some ways, most of all, was his struggle between his personal self and his professional self. And in that sense, I guess I'd say go with what feels right to you about your subject, right? You people are whole people. They don't just have professional lives. So I really wanted to bring a personal side to him. Although I try not to let it overwhelm his professional life.
Well, Dr. Leonard, you are at Colby College, which is a phenomenal liberal arts institution in the wonderful state of Maine. And I wonder if you could share with our readers, liberal arts schools teaching is so critical to that, very close interaction with a very small class. I wonder, when you have a class and you're talking about the Civil War, is there something in particular that you really try to impart upon your students about the war as a whole?
Well, I really try to get my students to think about it in the most complex way possible and to move and to think about it in its own time, as opposed to thinking about it. Most students who take a class on the Civil War with me already think they know a lot about the Civil War, and I really try to break them of that by making them read documents and other materials from the time. And I try to reinforce how much what we know about the Civil War has nothing to do with what people who lived through it knew about what was going on. So I think that's and then also I do try to talk about the way the Civil War has filtered down to us in the present, the way we now think about the war, and what does that have to do with the way people who lived through it understood what they were living through.
Well, finally, one last question for you. Can you give our viewers any sense of a future project, perhaps, that you're working on? Some new area of interest?
Well, unfortunately, maybe it's my age. I don't know, but I'm not exactly looking in a terribly new area. I can't seem to let Joseph Holt go. And to me, one of the most interesting aspects of his story is his transition from being a slaveholder, having grown up in the South, having grown up with slavery, to being someone who very passionately supported emancipation, black rights, and so on, to the point where many of his friends just said, stop already with the Negro. What is it with you and this? And so I think that that transition, though, is extremely interesting to me. And although I deal with it somewhat in the book, I want to do more. And I'm going down actually to the National Archives this summer to look at court-martial cases that involved and military commissions that involved black defendants, because whenever Holt, had to give an opinion, that's where I'm hoping to find some of his thoughts about these things, because we don't have just, letters from him saying, this is what I think about black rights, or this is why I made this transition. So I have to figure out how to find out more about that, but that's what I'd like to do.
Well, Dr. Leonard, it sounds like a wonderful project. Lincoln's Forgotten Ally in its own right is absolutely phenomenal. I neglected to mention at the beginning of our interview that this was a co-winner this year of the Lincoln Prize, presented jointly by Gettysburg College and the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History. So congratulations to you. And it's certainly one book that I heartily endorse that others read. And thank you very much for your time here on Behind the Lines.
Thank you very much.